Hello everyone, welcome to this afternoon's session on professional development of educators, not and educators. My name's Sherre and I'm facilitating the room this afternoon, and we have some four very interesting presentations in front of us. So, and because we've got a full afternoon, so 4 sessions, we'll run through each of the presentations first and keep all the questions to the end. So what I might do, first on my list is Teresa.
So welcome everybody. And Sherre, I'll keep an eye on the time, but you'll do some kind of movement towards me, will you?
I will let you know.
Block me. Okay. All right. So welcome. And this is, I don't know, maybe this was an exciting topic or you just came along to see what's Mad Teresa up to now, what's she planning. So my presentation is about liberating VET teachers for a stronger sector, and it's come from my 100 years or so in VET, and I see there's a few VET colleagues in the room who've also spent many hundreds of years in VET together, and we've seen many changes and many developments. So I prepared this little bit of a timeline, and it is a timeline, I know, without time on it. So if you think about at the beginning there, the post-1980s neoliberalism began, and I think much of this will resonate with the tertiary sector as well as with education generally, but there's a few reasons, as you know, to why VET is a little more sensitive to some of these issues. And then we come to the present day and what we're currently experiencing VET. So I spent many years hearing about neoliberalism and neoliberalism reforms without actually knowing what that meant. So there's a really cool book which gives you a brief history of neoliberalism. It's very exciting. But if you want to know, what that is and you didn't want to ask, it's actually a theory of political economic practices. And it proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills. So we're talking about free markets, free trade, etc. And this is where you'll see deregulation, privatisation, and Adam Harvey refers to this as the creative destruction of previously held institutional frameworks and powers. And this creates an environment in which all human activity is brought into the free market, and of course this includes education. So the effects of this was a turn towards a new vocationalism in education, and particularly for VET. But we were talking about education for work, whereas education, was previously a little more broader in its definition. It was about educating people for a good life or whatever it is that they wanted to be. There was an increased emphasis on instrumental and economic purposes of education, where its role became more and more aligned to the need to develop human capital to meet labour skill shortages. And I've got a lot of references if anybody wants to, find out a little bit more about this. Some of the main ones there are a few authors that you would probably get excited about if you were really into the neoliberalism effects. And if you wanted to know who they were, please get in touch and I will pass those on. So in Australia, VET has long held a prime position as an economic lever for governmental response to industry skill shortages. And so, we hear industry say, oh, we've got a shortage of workers in this area. Oh, quickly, let's get some VET quals out there. And so we're very sensitive to changes of government and government policy. And this has led to criticism of the potential for VET to be a means of preparing working class kids for working class jobs. So, for example, that started, 1977, but also as recently as 2017, people have been potentially criticising the potential for VET to become that kind of a lever. We also developed a culture of performativity where value has replaced its values, and created free markets where education has become a commercial commodity and created the environment for increasing unethical and unscrupulous practice. This has then impacted upon the discourse about VET. and vet quality, and influence the decreasing esteem of vet within the community, industry and the sector. And there's some, you know, really good people working in the vet sector who have been subject to that reduction in esteem in their sector and what it is to be a vet teacher or to work in the vet sector. It's also influenced then, as a response, the tightening regulatory controls, a view of quality as compliance, and also influencing the way that we prepare teachers and their professional development. So where the compliance is under the guise of quality, even though it can stand alongside, it's actually become, with our regulation, something that almost stands alone as an indicator of quality. I was only allowed 4 slides, so I had to pick some good ones. So these issues of quality have also resulted in a low autonomy because of the increased regulation. And if you look at the differences between the way the tertiary sector is regulated compared to the way that the vet regulator operates, you can see that that's quite clearly a very low autonomy environment. And of course, the low esteem and the mass media messaging, and the increased activity of the regulator, which is ASQA. And this has led to, I've described it as massification of the sector, using Freire's view on this, which means that it's undermining the individual autonomy and the development of critical consciousness. So where vet teachers' roles are reduced to that of an obedient technician, which is similar to the effects felt in other sectors and described by people like Sherre, the philosophers that are, you know, looking at the neoliberal reforms and the impact of that on education. So what does this look like? It's characterised and somewhat perpetuated by a domesticated or banking model of education and preparation for vet teachers. So it's prescriptive, it's anti-dialogical. And the alternative to that is a liberating education model, which is characterised by criticality, authentic choosing and being able to ask why. The preparation of our vet teachers is limited to a certificate for NTAE, which is necessarily prescriptive and competency-based, and it has been challenged in terms of its sufficiency, but for the moment, you know, we do the best that we can with that. Our CPD, our continuing professional development, is also necessarily heavily emphasising compliance and industry currency because of the activities of the regulator and the way that we need to interpret these. And we have a quiet but frustrated acceptance by vet teachers of the existing power positions, and the lack of agency to make changes to or to question the authority of the regulator. And some have described a standards movement in which good teaching is reduced to that which can be atomised and measured within a competency framework. So there is a quiet resistance, and the secret stories that teachers play out in the safe place of their classroom. They also have cover stories, which are the stories that they tell to address their compliance and regulatory requirements. They need to tick the boxes and they need to control the practices that are made visible to others outside of the classroom, but they also want to do the best that they can for their students, and they also want to be great teachers. So, what's an alternative, and what's the education for liberation about? A model for vet teachers could be more dialogical, it could be problem-centred, and it could focus on critical pedagogy. It might look like redesigned CPD policies which recognise the importance of developing the vet teacher more broadly as a person. It might provide support to participate in a more expansive range of PD, including programs which focus on the development of the person, as per Maxine Green, where the teacher must first know him or herself, or Nell Noddings, where a teacher should have broad knowledge in relational care, morals and ethics, or even David Hanson, which focuses on the development of personhood and ethical and moral decision-making. So practice in PD, which utilises critical thinking and the ability to ask why. The emancipation of our vet teachers and the development of their intellectual capital so that they feel that they have the power to speak up, to question, to push back and to create their own adventure somewhat, that they develop a voice. that they have self-efficacy and equal footing in amongst other sectors, and a collective strength, and create a movement for a stronger sector where quality is more aligned to student-focused experiences, the outcomes, the impact and the esteem, and the reasons why most VET teachers came into VET teaching. And in fact, most of the people who work in the VET sector came into the VET sector and VET education. They wanted to make a difference to people's lives. So that's all well and good, but it's not going to happen overnight, and there's challenges with that. And the challenges come from within. The challenges about the fear of being the first, the fear of the unknown, leaving a highly regulated environment, and the fear of jumping out of that safe tank into the unknown tank. There's the regulatory framework and the institutional policies and procedures that are in place to support it, and they're very important. They're there for a reason. We can't just disassemble those. For some, returning to study or challenging what you already know is a difficult challenge. It's like getting off the treadmill, getting off the hamster wheel. The oppressed may internalise and even participate in their own oppression, according to Sherre and Freeza, where emancipatory forms of knowledge may be refused by those who could benefit most, and that's a fairly normal reaction. But the change has to start from within the sector, the organisation and the person. It has to start with just one person. They need to look at research that is done by the sector, done by them and not to them, the dialogical development of a new approach, and find a way to enable our VET teachers to reconnect with the question of purpose in education, and purpose as in the purpose for which they arrived at VET teaching to start with, and not just the purpose for which they have become accustomed to as we become more highly regulated and we become better at meeting our regulatory requirements. So how am I going for time, Sherre? Because I did lose track there.
You've got about 3 minutes.
Yes, that's perfect. Okay. So I'm not anti-regulatory framework or anti-compliance. I need to make that really clear. I think that through no fault of our own, through no fault of our sector's own, except for the fact that we haven't had the capacity to push back, we have become a sector that's dominated by that need to meet the ever-increasing requirements, and sometimes confusing requirements or conflicting requirements of regulatory frameworks, and very, very active activities by the regulator, which sometimes are restrictive, sometimes don't make any sense, other times they do make sense, but we don't necessarily know the reason for that. So creating a culture where we can ask why or question or push back is not necessarily anti-compliance. It's actually something where we can all work together to create an even stronger and more liberated sector, which has greater impact for our students and ultimately for our community and our industry and our economy. The end, Sherre. This is a really odd way of presenting, isn't it? It's hard to gauge the room, but that's all right. So I do have, as I said, I've got references if anybody wants to know more about all of those things. Really fascinating reading for a Sunday afternoon or something, but there you go.
That's not bedtime reading, is it, Teressa?
Well, it is for me, but, you know, I will admit that's not everybody.
Thank you very much, Teressa. That was a very interesting presentation, and certainly there are some thoughts and ideas in there which I'll have to talk to you about as we're starting to develop up some PD for staff. So I think you've got some really good points in there, particularly the one where it is, well, why have people come to VET? What was their purpose in becoming a VET teacher? And it's the same for higher education. A lot of the people that come in from a clinical background have come because they want to help new people enter the profession, all of those sorts of bits and pieces. So the reasoning why people come is the same no matter whether you're in VET or HE, but we do need to pull that back into their conscious mind again as we move them forward and as everybody walks through those challenges in the minefield of quality and compliance and everything else. Okay, we might have time for one question before I move on. Are there any questions that are burning questions, or can everything wait? All right, we might move on then. Joe, I think you're next on my list. Developing VET educators' teaching practice through reflection and scholarship.
Thank you, Sherre. I'm actually talking about, I'm telling a story about something, I guess, that's going on in our institution at the moment, and some work that we've been doing here that actually follows very nicely from Teresa's discussion about teachers and who they are and how they consider their own practices and where they come from. So it was almost like it was planned that way. So as you can see from what I have on the slide there are some things about the context, I guess, in which VET educators are working in Australia, probably internationally, and within our own institution that I guess are the underpinning ideas behind some work we've been doing here. So the first is that notion that university qualifications are actually quite important for VET teachers, and there's a lot said in the literature at the moment about the contribution of those things to professional standing. And Teresa, you were talking about, sorry, I'll just have to hang up on the person. You were talking before about that notion of professional standing and who, how teachers, VET teachers are positioned within the larger kind of group of educators within our industry. Also the notion that it's important for developing the way that VET educators teach by there is a call for embedding practicums in qualifications for early career VET teachers so that they can go through that process, the same sorts of things that we get our undergrad educators to do, to work through to develop knowledge and skills around education. And there's also research and anecdotal evidence from our own institution that VET teachers want to investigate their teaching practice beyond their Cert 4, and that this certainly is an issue for some of our VET teachers who I've had the good fortune to come in contact with through the grad cert, about how they can actually improve what they're doing and do that in a scholarly kind of way. So our dual sector status actually just hands us on plate the perfect opportunity to be able to wed all of these ideas together. The Graduate Certificate of Tertiary and Adult Ed, which Sherre knows quite intimately, she was the former head of course, is one of those places that we can address some of these issues. So the question that we were asking ourselves was, in this climate, how could we actually develop the GCTAE further so that it address the needs of VET educators, particularly within our institution, and for those, obviously, those students who come to us from outside of our institution. And how could we support them? So not just get them to think about teaching practice, but how could we support them to examine their teaching practices and with a focus on improvement? And then how should we frame a unit for that purpose that's simply focused on improving teaching practices? And who would be involved in that? Who would be the people who could best support that? So in this context, what we've done is, first of all, I want you to admire that, because, that took me ages. But these design principles are actually at the heart of what we've done. So we've put together a new unit as part of the grade cert that is about bringing our VET educators to the table in considering their teaching practices in a scholarly and reflective way. So we've designed this unit, it's a final capstone unit, and at the heart of this unit is the notion of teaching practice and its improvement that's informed by scholarship and informed by reflection. Now, when we were thinking about the ways in which we could best do this, we decided that, I am actually using the royal we here, there was a focus on supporting people to do this, as well as getting them to think about and delve into research around practice as well. So we put in place two aspects of the unit, and one is a mentoring relationship, and the other is a framework to support students in their thinking about their own practice. So the mentoring relationship is really about peer review. So we had thought, we actually struggled with the notion of practicum for a while and thought about how a practicum could suit educators who are currently actually working in, you know, our institution, and how that sort of traditional notion of practicum might be quite difficult for us to undertake. You know, the practicum is very much a very intensive sort of process where a person, I guess, acts in some respects as an apprentice. And so we thought more about this notion of peer review and how we could actually get our experienced educators within our institution to support our VET educators to reflect and in a scholarly way on their teaching practices. So we then had to think about how we could actually frame this so that they were supported in the journey of doing this. And I went to an action research framework for this. So the idea was that we needed to recognise the need for teachers to research quality practices and look for answers to practice questions through what they could see in the research, what they were identifying their own needs were, and then being able to put this in place with a mentor. And then the overall evidence of what they've done would be the assessment tasks that come out of this unit. And the first one is an e-portfolio, which gives us the evidence of the mentoring relationship. It requires students to collect observations, lesson plans, a whole range of practice and planning artefacts, and artefacts of feedback and engagement, I guess, in that way, with that feedback and improvement through looking at subsequent kind of work that they do. Then the second assessment task is a report on the action research project part of the unit. And so this is the point at which they look back at all of the data that they've collected and they answer a research question, but I'll talk about how they got to that in a moment. So we are in the midst of our pilot of this unit at the moment. So term 2, it runs again in term 3, and we have a grand total of 2 students in it at the moment, which has been a very nice way to begin. So the mentoring process itself obviously is based on a lot of the literature that we've pulled out of education, and there's a long history in undergrad education or school education of practicum and mentoring. So we went to the literature, I went to the literature on mentoring and thought about how we could use our mentors within the unit in order to support our students. So I thought about this iterative nature of the relationship first of all. So we needed a mentor to be able to go on this journey with the student, and it needed to be you know, where they started with them at the beginning to look at what it was they needed to identify, then assist them to plan, look at their teaching, provide feedback, and then be part of their reflections as well. So it became a cyclical kind of relationship. So students would identify what it was they were going to do, then they would talk to their mentor about possible issues and identify some action steps. And then they would do some observations and plan a strategy, prepare a lesson plan, again, go back to their mentor, talk about that planning, get some feedback on that, adjust a bit further, and then deliver the lesson, get feedback and reflect, and then start the whole cycle again. So we were asking for the mentors to be involved in a minimum of 5 to 7 lessons across the unit, or across the term that the inner unit that the vet educator was teaching. And it had to be, you know, it could be any sort of delivery process that they were involved in. It needed to be something that was useful to them. The mentor was therefore going to do these things that are listed on the right there. So engaging in substantive conversations and working to identify areas, providing opportunities to observe. So those things that I referred to before. We sent out, before the unit began, we sent out an EOI to experienced higher ed and vet teachers. Within the uni, we knew we were only going to have small numbers of students, so we didn't spread it too widely at this point. And those who were interested in becoming part of the pilot put in an EOI, and then we matched students to mentors. In this term, we took a bit of a pragmatic approach, actually, because we had only 2 students, and those 2 students were on campus on one campus. So I actually chose mentors who were on the same campus, so that we could see, you know, whether possibly how the face-to-face, I guess, mentoring was going to work. Sherre, how much longer have I got?
About 4 minutes.
Okay. All right. So that's the mentoring part of it. Now, here's the action research part. So this was a framework that I gave to students that actually shows them how to step through the action research cycle. And you can see that there is an overlap between what they did there, and then there was and what they did in their mentoring relationship as well. So step 1 was about identifying an action research need in your practice. So this was about them coming from what they could see in their own practices. Now, we put up 4 areas of and case studies that they could have a look at if they needed some sort of, you know, prompting around ideas that might be of interest. So one of them was around assessment, one was engagement in the online environment. So it was, you know, the students could look at those cases and think, well, you know, is this actually an area I would like to investigate? And then they identified a research question that they try and answer. And that was going to be the driving force of their mentoring relationship and the whole unit for them. And then they had to think of ways to tackle the problem. And that included having a look at the literature and finding out what other people had done work in that area and what they'd found and what some of the things were that they could try. And they worked very closely with their mentors around ideas from them as well. Step 3 was to actually carry out those changes, and this is the iterative approach. They collect some data about how it went. So that data at this stage was feedback from the mentor, it was observations of the mentor, it was their self-assessment as well. You know, how did it go? How did I think it went? It was also, you know, observations of students and their perceptions, their engagement, if that was one of the, you know, the key kind of drivers for what it was they were trying to do, and then a bit of an evaluation, then decide on what they do next. So yes, and then we'll go back to the beginning of that step, and that went on throughout the unit of work. And step 4 was the point at which they would make an overall assessment of what the changes had done in terms of their practice. As you'll see in that middle column there were materials put up on Moodle that would assist them to do all of these things. So, you know, I had to have things in there like how do I interact with the literature? How do I draw out information from the literature? How do I search in the literature? What does scholarship mean?
2 minutes, Joe.
Thank you. Module 3 was then about gathering data. It gave them some lesson planning templates, some observations templates. We drew on some of the learning teaching guides there. How do you actually then take the literature to tell you what to do. And then Module 4 actually guided them through the process of writing that scholarship and practice report. I got a course-based ethics approval so that the students could gather some data from their own students, and ultimately the aim is that what they come out with from this is the structure for an article that could be published. So it's not where it needs to be at this point in time, but the report I set up so that it actually had the framework of an article. So a description of context, a statement of the research focused question, statement of the methods, outline of the findings and implications. So what I wanted them to be able to do was to be able to see that what they'd conducted was research, and that the next step could potentially be developing that report up into a scholarly article to be published. That's we're almost at the point of, I think the e-portfolios have gone in or are going in this week, and then I'll be doing some workshops with the students, the 2 students, around, you know, progressing that final assessment task, which is the written report. That's about it, Sherre.
Well, that's time. Thank you. Any questions for Jo on that? We will have time after all of them, but if there was a burning question in relation to that? No, everybody understood that perfectly, Jo, so very well done. We will keep moving. So Mel and Minka were presenting on getting down and dirty with reverse articulation.
Lovely. All right. Thank you so much for that. So like Minka said, there's actually 3 of us that are presenting today. It's myself, Mel Hayman. I'm the head of course for Bachelor of Allied Health. Then we have the lovely Helen Magnussen, who is our Manager of Educational Quality and Standards Assurance for Learning and Teaching. And then we have Minka, Elliot as well, who is also the coordinator of our Academic Pathways Learning and Teaching team. So our session today is really going to talk to or provide you with a really brief overview of the process involved in what we now currently refer to as reverse articulation. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, I'd like to just touch base on my reverse articulation story, just to help set the scene. So about 3 years ago, I was involved in completing the very first 5-year review for the Bachelor of Allied Health. And when I was doing some of the research in this review process, it became really clear to me that our students were going to really, really struggle to gain employment within the allied health industry because they didn't hold what's considered the minimum qualification within industry, which is a recognised Certificate 3 in allied health assistance. So when I found this out, it really got me thinking, and I'm thinking, surely there must be a way for me to be able to provide access to this award for my students. Just imagine if I could have my students graduate with, for example, dual sector awards. So in doing that, we would then be able to produce graduates that not only had a bachelor's level qualification, but also the minimum qualification to be able to gain employment within the industry. Not only would that be beneficial, but it would also put our students in potentially the best possible position, because they would be more qualified than anyone else in that current position applying for jobs. So what I then thought is, what if we can make this happen early on in their degree? And then that would mean then that if they had this minimum VET qualification, they could start working after potentially their first year of study. And then that would enable them to develop industry connections, develop really nice working professional relationships and so on. And that, I think, is where my reverse articulation journey began. So that's where it began, and this is where it is now. So as you can see, we've aged quite a little bit in the process, but in doing so, we're extremely excited today to share with you, along with Helen and Minka, who have been really my 2 fundamental wingmen throughout this process, what we've been able to accomplish in the reverse articulation space, and to really talk you through the first CQU reverse articulation formal process that you now as educators will be able to follow and to embed and articulate into your own higher education degrees, courses and so on. So let's begin. So let's start with the actual definition of reverse articulation. At the end of the day, it really is undertaking a comprehensive mapping exercise where the knowledge and performance evidence requirements, as in learning outcomes and VET qualifications, are mapped against the knowledge and assessment requirements, learning outcomes, of a series of higher education units. When this mapping exercise is complete, what it does is it enables students to then be able to receive credit, which is the value assigned to the recognition of equivalence in that content in learning outcomes between different types of learning and or qualifications. So what that meant when we apply it to my reverse articulation journey is that I mapped the VET requirements from the Cert 3 in Allied Health Assistance to the content that was being delivered in the first year of our Bachelor of Allied Health. And in being able to do that, what we've now been able to offer is our students can, at the end of their first year of successful study within the Bachelor of Allied Health, apply through VET for that certification. And that's a formal process now. So when we talk about a formal process, Minka has been heavily involved in this. Now, what you can see here is a fairly complicated, potentially overwhelming flow diagram. But at the end of the day, it can be broken down into 4 really simple phases. So the very first phase is really that initial research that goes into the reverse articulation. So that involves things like having a look at the VET qualifications in scope and looking at whether or not CQUniversity currently offers that VET qualification on scope. Then we look at the administrative side of things. It's still phase 1 where we go, all right, well, let's complete a reverse articulation proposal document. And that's all done through the academic pathways, or who we refer as APT. And the reason we do that is so that we can get some sort of official registry for people that are wanting to do reverse articulation, just so that we can keep a record of these types of things, so that we can support people doing it and moving forward in the future. And that's really all phase 1 is. Phase 2 is probably the most significant because phase 2 involves a fairly extensive mapping exercise. And again, what we're trying to do is identify where we can map across or reverse articulate all of the content from the certificate, the VET certificate or the diploma, across and map it up to higher education. Right? And I'm going to actually show you an example of that once I finish the presentation. So that mapping exercise is fairly detailed and fairly significant. But what we do in this exercise is we bring all of our teaching experts, whether it be VET or HE, together so that we can really rely on and collectively use the knowledge of everyone involved in that process. So what might happen is I might, for example, be leading the mapping process as a head of course or someone that's designated as a reverse articulation lead. And then from that, I would then reach out to my higher education teaching experts. So those experts would be the teachers that would be involved in delivering the higher education content that we would be using in that reverse articulation process. And then we do the same thing from the VET side. So we reach out to the VET teaching experts, and they would be the experts that deliver the current content for the Allied Health Assistance VET Award, so that then we're reaching and checking and drawing upon both the VET expertise as well as the higher education expertise in this mapping process. Once we complete the mapping document, what we do then is we move on to the next phase pretty much. And phase 3 is then really that reverse articulation validation. And that really just involves some administrative processes. So once we've developed the mapping document, we want to make sure it's accurate and it's also complete. We want to make sure we register it. We want to make sure that we've put it through all of the right processes. So lodged it through our course committee, which would then be noted in education committee and so on. So really the biggest part of doing in the reverse articulation process is in phase 2, where we talk about that mapping document. After it's validated, what we have then is a little celebration where we all get really excited for the hard work that we've done and the amazing benefits that the reverse articulation process will bring to our students. And then it's just a matter of keeping it up to date, because what happens is every 3 to 5 years, each of the VET competencies or each of the VET qualifications are updated. And what we need to do is we need to make sure as higher education educators that our reverse articulation is up to date and aligns appropriately and correctly with those updated versions. So when VET update their packages, we need to also make sure that we're updating our reverse articulation mapping document so that they go hand in hand and they really mirror each other, especially in that mapping process. So what I will do now is I will just bring up what we refer to as the mapping document. So hopefully you guys can all see that. It's a nice Excel spreadsheet. Great. So really briefly, this is our mapping document that we are using. So along the bottom here, we have yellow tabs and also blue tabs. So the yellow tabs just indicate the core VET units, and the blue tabs indicate the electives units within the Allied Health Assistant VET Award. So your mapping document will be different to mine and anyone else's, because there's different units and different numbers of units, whether it be core or electives in each of the VET awards. But for the Allied Health Assistance Award, we've got these electives and also these core units. So what we have here is a completed mapping activity. So
10 minutes, Mel.
No worries. So we've got all of the VET knowledge, elements, performance criteria, performance evidence, and so on. And then here we've taken all of the higher education information and we've aligned them. So what you can see when we look along here is that, say, for example, we are looking at the knowledge evidence of cells, tissues, and organs. So that's some of the content that's delivered within HLTH AAP 001, which is the VET unit code for this. If we look at that, what we can say is that we actually do cover that, and we teach that content and we teach it in this unit and we deliver it in week 1. And it's not enough to just show when we actually teach it, but how we also assess it, because it's important from that perspective that we can make sure we're also able to say to VET, yeah, look, we not only deliver it, but we assess it, and here is evidence of it being assessed, so that we can prove that our students are competent when it comes to that knowledge evidence. Now, there are some areas that we aren't able to reverse articulate. Now, in that instance, there's a couple of different options, and these options are different for every single reverse articulation process. It might be that you develop a new unit and it's offered as an elective unit that covers all of this content. It might be that there's only a little bit of content that can't be reverse articulated, so you look at maybe an opportunity to develop a resource through our CPD, our Centre for Professional Development. Okay, so with this comes different options at this stage, but this is really what it looks like. This is what the mapping document looks like. And to wrap that all up, that is pretty much what the reverse articulation process is. So on that note, and keeping to time, I'm going to hand it over to you. So we do have Helen and Minka here, and the reason for that is because it's involved a significant amount of guidance from both Helen and Minka and their departments. So if you've got any questions in regards to the VET side of things, Helen will be able to jump in and answer. Any questions in regards to the processing or the procedures side of things, Minka's there from the academic pathways. Or if you've got any specific questions for me or my journey, then feel free to fire them at me. But I'll throw it out to you guys now, and we'll field any questions.
Thank you, Mel. Any burning questions for Mel while she unshares her screen?
Hi, Mel. It's Dean. How many students have undertaken the reverse articulation today?
This is actually, Dean, the very first time that we will offer it in term 3.
Thank you.
No worries.
All right, so I'll keep moving along. We've got one more presentation, but if you think of any questions about for Mel or for Minka or for Helen, either just drop them in the chat or save them up till later. We'll move on to our last one. Ty, I saw Ty around in the list. Ty, are you ready to present? Oh, in a big room all by yourself. All right, if you're ready, you can share your screen and we'll let you get started.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here with me in this virtual conference room. Now, this is my topic for today, and before I actually talk about this topic, I'd like to share with you a little bit of, let me go through a little bit of background of some information related to this topic. I have been teaching in the laboratory operation courses for almost 2 years. And during my teaching and also my own experience when I had an opportunity to do the industry engagement. So I actually went to visit a few industry last year and the year before, and I could see some of the challenges and also the issues that the VET trainers, students, and also the industry are facing, especially in this century, the century of the technologies. So this is the outline of what I'm going to talk through today. So there are 4 parts that I like to cover with you. Now, the first one, why the 21st technologies? As you all know, that we are facing or surrounding by lots of technology starts from home, like telephone, laptop, computer, iPad, TV, etc. at home, to schools where students can also have virtual headsets for their studies, and to our workplaces. Depends on where you're from and what work you are doing. You might at least every day you are facing with some kind of technologies, whether it's a virtual or hands-on every day. So let me share a story with you about this state-of-the-art equipment. Now, I got to know this equipment when I went to visited the head office of one of Australia's largest pathology services business. It's out of my imagination. When I got there, I saw more modern equipment than the people actually being there for the work. And they actually need this kind of high technologies and a state-of-the-art of this kind of equipment, because every day they receive hundreds or thousands of samples. And in order for them to do the tests with the high quality and the high requirements, they need something could run the samples quickly and correctly, and therefore the technologies step in and help them with that kind of business. And when I talk with one of the managers there, and he said that he's crying for staff or someone who actually can understand and run this kind of equipment. And he said that if we can train our students be able to understand the scientific background or theory of the machine and be able to run the machine, they're happy to take our students on board for their work. Now, this is a kind of mass spectrometer, but this is a matrix-assisted laser disruption ionization time of flight. It's quite a long name. So basically, it's used to detect and localize of drugs, proteins, and lipids in biological tissue. So they can do a lot of things and very smart machine as well. The next story I would like to share with you is these machines. As you can see, they are automatic titration. So at our simulated laboratory, we teach our students to do the titration manually, and they are required to have skills and time to do the work. But in the industry, and these kind of machines are actually, when I visited the Rio Tinto in Glaston the year before, and they had a few of them. And when I talked with the staff there, they said that they have staff who can run these equipment thoroughly, but they don't understand the scientific theory behind of these machines. And they like us, if possible, to train their staff or to train the students to understand the scientific theory of the machine or behind the scenes of these equipment rather than just running the machine. Because at work, they have the standard operation procedures, which everyone can read and follow the procedures easily. But to understand the background, the theory of the machine requires a bit of knowledge and needs to study. So from those examples and those stories, it's actually, it was a nice wake-up call for me to think about the capabilities in what kind of the needs that the industry may require, and also consider what we can provide our students to prepare them for the ever-changing jobs that such a business needed. So that leads to the next question: what are the skills that employees and industry jobs require? So I would like to have a bit of information from you, whether you're from the higher education or you are here and you're from the VET area. Could you please give your thumb up or a wave so that have a bit of background for me? I can see much actually. Yeah, so if you are from the higher education, I think what I'm going to talk soon is quite comfortable for you. But if you are from VET, you may need to know the abbreviation of this term. So the thing that we need to prepare ourselves for students to meet the industry and the available jobs in this century is STEM. So STEM is abbreviation for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So that's why for higher education staff, I think you have less problems than our VET staff. Because when you are in higher education, you have students come to you directly from high schools where they are actually train themselves to have lots of information on skills for these areas. So for VET staff, we will have some obstacles, and I will cover that a bit later on. Now, with the STEM skills, they are, first is the problem solving, critical thinking, flexibility, data interpretation, creativity, and innovation foundations. So these are the skills that we need to train our students and get them ready and to meet the industry jobs or the requirements from the industries or wherever they go to work later on. Now, the obstacles for students, especially students from VET, to gain these skills are these skills we cannot develop or train them overnight. They need time, and they need to do lots of exercise, and it's a build on and on from day after day. And also these skills, especially for students either left school early or have been away from school for lots of time, is quite difficult because they may forget what they learned from the high school before or how to solve the problems. So therefore, it's quite difficult for VET staff to train them. But if we're lucky to have successfully returning students to education, and if we introduce them to the new technology while developing STEM skills foundation, which requires lots of patience and support from different areas.
10 minutes, Ty.
Thank you. And we have less of the modern equipment which we can use or let students to put their hands on at the simulated laboratories. So with those obstacles, how can we move forward? The only thing we can move forward to cope with the current situation is first to increasing the STEM teacher workforce and try to get more fund from the government or different sources as much as we can. Now with increasing the STEM teacher workforce, first we have to gear up ourselves and get ready for all of the technologies that are surrounded us and available at our workplace. So it means that we can be comfortable for ourselves and how to use different kinds like Moodle, Kahoot, H5P, all of the platforms and the facilities that we have. And recently we have Lunchbox series, which running by Teressa and Susie Burgers. So if we can get ourselves involved with most of the ideas and the technologies that we have at the moment and understand and how to use it, because when you gear up yourself, you actually help yourself to build a learning and teaching materials, be able to engage students, and also to help you to break the, to serve some of the centered models. For example, I call it and bar. With these models, with the it and bar models, with it models, you can have experience for yourself with these technologies and also for your students. Raise awareness for yourself and for your students. With theories, you can put your teaching materials with those kinds of technologies. It will make your teaching materials more interesting, more engagement to students, and easy to follow. With the bar theory, if you're in the classroom or in the simulated laboratories, you can break the silence or ice breaking, so students can be engaged easily and allow the networking for both parties, you and the students, and also relevant to the content that you're teaching is much easier for students to follow. Then you can collaborate with the industry and equipment manufacturers for short loan or even to have the access to their equipment with the recent changes in the technology. And then finally, we need to find outside of the classroom tools and resources for students with to support students with a bit of foundation scientific knowledge when students kind of have less knowledge about that in a particular area. And with that kind of support, it's good to reach regional and remote students. Now, finally, I have a key message which I like to share with you, that VET training is crucial for satisfying the needs of the industry, employers, and employees, but we cannot continue successfully using the 20th century methods. So in order to meet the 21st century demands, we need to have a new training approach, which we can apply different technologies for our learning and teaching materials. So therefore, this is the last message that I'd like to share with you. And thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Ty. You're about 30 seconds to go, so you timed that really, really well. If you'd like to unshare your screen, we can see everybody again. That's all our presentations for today, and we've had quite a bit of a mix, but all have been related to VET. So has anybody got any questions or comments? Mel very kindly answered Lucia's question in the chat. So if you haven't spotted that, the question was, oops, stop. Sorry, it's my timer. Question was, do you expect that students will then seek to gain employment based on the TAFE qual that Mel had reverse articulated and continue to study? So Mel said, yes, we expect that students will continue their higher ed study after gaining their VET award, as is the minimum requirement to gain employment, yet a bachelor qualification will further their education, thus making them even more employable and able to climb the ladder, as well as performing jobs outside of the scope of the Cert 3 award. The VET award will give them access to the industry, and their bachelor will present them with further opportunities beyond that. So that's just catching everybody up on that. Have we got any questions for our presenters today? Helen.
Hi, Sherre. Could I just ask Jo Dargusch a question? First of all, thanks, Jo, for your presentation. I love the idea of the embedded practicums for our teachers because, again, I think it's that one step further to what they've been doing in the Certificate 4. And it was something that we used to do years ago with the Bachelor of Vocation Education and Training. And, of course, when they disbanded that particular qualification, we didn't have anything around practicums, and I think that is something that we need to get back to. So my questions are I wasn't quite sure in the end whether they were doing a practicum and were they being observed by their mentor? And the second question is, what training will the mentors receive, and could this be part of micro-credentialing perhaps?
Yeah, good questions, Helen. Thank you. Look, we struggled with that notion of the practicum because a practicum obviously, we looked at the TAFE definition of it, and they were talking about 50 hours of observed teaching with some other things wrapped in there as well. Now, our problem is that our teachers obviously are in full-time employment, the ones that are working for us. So to actually then be able to get a mentor who can observe for that period of time then is a huge workload imposed on them. So we couldn't go for the 50 hours. So what we did instead was that we sort of said to the mentors that there would be a block of time in which they would be involved with their student, and that would include the time when they were giving them feedback. It would include the time when they observed their classes as well. So it isn't 50 hours, but that so yes, there is direct observation of classes, and there is there are conversations that take place prior to that where they look at the planning for the class together, where they talk about the planning documents, where advice is given and discussed, and then the observation occurs. They're given written feedback around that observation, and then the mentors, also discuss that with them, and then they plan the next cycle of what they're teaching. So, for instance, one of the people who's involved at the moment, who sits outside my office here, wanted to look at how she could facilitate better uptake of certain concepts in res schools. So she actually had her mentor look at her planning for some online pre-teaching, and then the way that was actually then taken up in a lesson in front of the students. So yes, that the mentor observed both of those things. At the moment, the mentors are actually people who are working in learning, teaching and services in their ALC. So there are, there's considerable kind of, I suppose, expertise there already for this pilot. But that's one of the things that we have been talking about, is that, you know, what do we do to ensure that our mentors are actually properly trained for the process? And we did have some training that occurred, but as this was a pilot, that's probably not firmed up yet. But micro-credentialing is a possible option here. If we get large numbers of students in the unit, we're going to have to consider where we draw our mentors from. But at this point in time, you know, we're still working with quite low numbers. But yeah, Helen, that is something that I would certainly like to talk to someone about what we can do there.
Sorry, excellent, Jo, because we actually, prior to merge, had a mentoring program in place with all our new teachers. But when we came over and merged, a lot of those mentors became QCs. So the role dissipated because there just wasn't time left for those people. You can't keep drawing on the same people's expertise, and so the mentoring did fall by the wayside. So it was good to see that it has come back up in the GCTAE. So thank you for sharing that.
That's okay. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Helen and Jo. Any other questions for our presenters today? No? Lots of thoughtful things to go away and think about. If there are no other questions, thank you everyone for coming, and I'll see you all around the traps at some point.
Thanks, Sherre.